welcome everybody from inside our community, but extended particularly warm welcome to everybody coming from outside, from the Budapest community, from our colleagues and friends in embassies and other universities and other research institutes. I want to particularly welcome Allison Stanger. Allison, as some of you will know, attended our Academic Freedom Conference in June 2017 and made an unforgettable presentation in this hall about her own experience with illiberal intolerance on an American campus. I won't rehearse the whole story, but she was at Middlebury College and has been a distinguished professor there, and was subjected to really grotesque intimidation, which raised fundamental issues about how to defend academic freedom. I think everybody in the room will be aware that this university has faced a long 3-year defense of its own academic freedom and faced enormous pressures from external sources, i.e. the government of Hungary. But we have never forgotten in our discussion of that problem that there are also internal threats to academic freedom, pressures from inside our community that restrict freedom, favor fashionable, progressive, liberal ideas to the exclusion of any idea which challenged that broad consensus. That's a problem for an open society institution. I'm an old liberal. That's my house. But our house can destroy itself unless we're welcoming and open to new ideas and different ideas and ideas that contradict our prejudices and our opinions and moral convictions. So Allison is a decorated veteran in the struggle to defend that simple idea of a university, and so it's especially nice to have her back in the House. She's a distinguished political scientist. She's the Russell J. Long Professor of International Politics and Economics at Middlebury College. It's a very distinguished liberal arts college in the United States. She's currently the Technology and Human Values Senior Fellow at the Edmund J. Safra Center for Ethics at a small, struggling place called Harvard University. So she's in an extremely distinguished institute, two very distinguished institutions. She has also been involved with a number of other distinguished institutions. She has written an important book called Whistleblowers, Honesty in America from Washington to Trump. With the timing that never deserts CEU, we have chosen to have a lecture on whistleblowers in the week in which Edward Snowden, probably the most famous whistleblower in the world, has just published his book. So our timing, as you'll be aware, we planned this for months and months to get this to align, and it was all deliberate. You will be following the Edward Snowden story. He is a locus classicus of the issue that we'll be discussing today. Allison will talk to us on, her title is Committing Truth, the Ethics and Politics of Whistleblowing in Europe and the United States. She'll talk for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have a discussion, and I will guide that discussion. And the event, which starts now, will end promptly at 7 o'clock, and because I always forget this afterwards, I better say it now. For those of you who are new to our house, we give you a drink and bogach and nice stuff up in the aula afterwards, so hang on, because you'll get fed afterwards. How about that? Okay, Allison, warm welcome to CEU.
Thank you. Well, hello there. It's good to be back in Budapest at this critical moment in world history and Hungary's history. I'm going to present an argument to you here today that may sound provocative or partisan or just very American to some of you, but it is meant to make you think. I will talk about politics but I am not a politician. I study politics, and I have the privilege of being a tenured professor. As such, my job, as I see it, is to say what's true. So I will say things publicly here today that Speaker of the House, U.S. Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, will not or cannot. And I believe I'm morally obligated to do so. Of course, you're free to disagree with me, but I'm going to put an argument out there for you, and we'll contend with it. This talk originates in my book, which Michael mentioned, but it really goes back to my previous book. I wrote a book called One Nation Under Contract, The Privatization of American Power and the Future of Foreign Policy, and it was really a study of the creeping privatization of foreign policy institutions in the United States and their implications for democratic politics and also foreign policy. What I realized is that government was slowly being hollowed out in the United States, and the business of government was increasingly business as contracted work began to replace the work of government employees. These public-private partnerships seemed very promising, but I realized that with this change, we were putting an enormous amount of faith in our elites, specifically corporate elites. And I wondered, how are we going to keep our elites honest with this change in affairs? And I became really interested in that question. And so this interest in whistleblowers comes out of an interest in the question of how we keep our elites honest. For the book, I interviewed the entire senior leadership of the NSA at the time of the Snowden heist, and also Edward Snowden and a number of other NSA whistleblowers. It was an extraordinarily difficult book to write for a variety of reasons. I mean, take the case of Edward Snowden. There you really had two narratives. The NSA whistleblowers on the one hand, the NSA on the other. They had nothing whatsoever in common. And so I saw my job in this book is to look at whistleblowers and look at both sides of the argument and try to figure out what was true to the best of my ability. And that was very difficult to do. I actually had an entire draft of the manuscript finished, and then the Snowden controversy broke. So I was thinking about whistleblowers before Snowden. Then Snowden happened, I realized, oh my goodness, I've got to understand this. It's an incredibly technical topic. It began to balloon, become longer and longer, and I realized it's another book, so I'll be writing another book that deals with most of it. But it was a learning experience. But it turns out it's really useful because last week, you may or may not have followed this, but the chair of the House Intelligence Committee, Adam Schiff, told the press that the top U.S. intelligence official, acting director of national intelligence, Joseph McGuire, was illegally withholding from Congress a whistleblower complaint that may involve Donald Trump. And this is ongoing right now. It's extraordinarily interesting. No director of national intelligence has ever previously refused to turn over a whistleblower complaint from the Inspector General. So last Friday, with McGuire still refusing to comply, Congress issued a subpoena for the information, and he will need to testify before Congress on Thursday if he fails to provide it. So what's going on here? It's pretty clear that McGuire, very similar to many of the chief officials in the United States government today, he's acting, right? He's just gotten there because the number one and the number two resigned very recently, like the revolving door that's taking place in Washington. It's pretty clear that he is following orders to break with precedent. But I want to argue to you here today, this is part of a much larger pattern. You probably have already noticed it with Donald Trump, but every sort of norm is being thrown out the window in American constitutional democracy. So what I want to argue today, and it's an argument in my book, which tells, it's a history of whistleblowing in America. But I use that history to illuminate this argument, which I want to focus on today. And that's this: the American intelligence community is blowing the whistle on Donald Trump for failing to uphold his oath to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. That is, they are doing so. They are behaving in an unprecedented fashion, leaking all sorts of information to protect the system itself, the liberal democratic system. Properly understood, I'm going to argue, whistleblowing is not a partisan issue, although populists will always spin it as such. Whistleblower protection, I'm going to argue, is an appropriate bipartisan response, and this applies in other liberal democracies as well, to America's current predicament. It's a means of holding Washington accountable to both Americans and the international community. So that's the thumbnail sketch of the argument. I want to structure my remarks into 4 sections. I first want to talk about the origins of this concept of whistleblowing. It's very interesting. It's actually a very American concept. Second, it's very important that we define our terms, because I'm going to take you on a tour of whistleblowing in Europe. And what we're going to find is that it means different things in different country contexts. So I want to be sure we all know we're talking about the same thing. Third, I want to discuss specifically this argument I laid out to you about Trump and the intelligence community, which I think will become, make more sense to you with this groundwork. And finally, I want to discuss the implications for both the United States and Europe, looking forward. So that's our agenda, and I want to leave plenty of time for questions. So let's begin. Whistleblower rights and protection in the United States are as old as the New Republic itself. I'm going to tell you a little story about the first whistleblower protection law in the United States, because it's really interesting. It's chapter 2 of my book. It's going to be excerpted in the Atlantic, so you'll get a sneak preview. In 1777, during the Revolutionary War with Britain, a group of 10 American sailors revealed that their Commodore Essex Hopkins had tortured British prisoners of war. And they submitted a petition to the Continental Congress alleging that Hopkins had, quote, treated prisoners in the most inhuman and barbarous manner. What did Congress do? During wartime, it voted to remove Hopkins from his position, and Hopkins retaliated by accusing 2 of the whistleblowing sailors of libel and having them arrested. There were actually 10 sailors who filed the complaint, but Hopkins was from Rhode Island, so he focused on the Rhode Island sailors. Because remember, the United States is just being born. And they're thrown in jail. So the imprisoned soldiers, Richard Marvin and Samuel Shaw, petitioned Congress to secure their release from prison. And this is during wartime. Usually during wartime, people let things pass, but not in this instance. Congress instead responded on July 30th, 1778, by issuing the first American whistleblower protection law. And its language, which I want to read to you, captures the intimate relationship that the American founders perceived between the upholding of whistleblower rights and the maintenance of their new republic. It read this way. It said, that it is the duty of all persons in the service of the United States, as well as all other inhabitants thereof, to give the earliest information to Congress or any other proper authority of any misconduct, frauds, or misdemeanors committed by any officers or persons in the service of these states which may come to their knowledge. So you are obligated to report corruption, misconduct, if you're part of this new endeavor. And Congress did not stop at celebrating whistleblowing as an activity connected to their ideals. They also legislated to protect whistleblowers from retaliation, and they paid the legal fees of Marvin and Shaw, the 2 maligned sailors. Congress also passed a law to ensure that future whistleblowers would have legal counsel to fight their libel charges. And in a final demonstration of their convictions, Congress authorized that all records related to the Hopkins case be released to the public, which is why we can talk about this here today. They made all the records public. So even before the ratification of the Constitution, the importance of whistleblowing as a means of exposing important truths was part of America's DNA. There are lots of bumps along the road. This is like a beautiful story. I tell the ugly stories too in my book, but I wanted to start with a beautiful story. And it's also a super interesting story, because that story I've just told you, which has appeared in an op-ed in the New York Times and is generally accepted, is only part of the story. It's only part of the story. I found out using digital archives. A lot of the founding documents of the United States have been digitized, so students out here, this is a really cool thing to do. Search on keywords in digitized archives, and you will see new patterns. So that's what I did, and what did I find? I found that Essex Hopkins, he tortured British prisoners of war, and he was a thoroughly disgusting human being. They were right. He was barbarous. But the real reason he was removed from his post as Commodore of the US Navy was not for torturing British prisoners of war, awful as that might be, but because he was defying George Washington's orders. He was defying Congress during the Revolutionary War. What was he doing? He was taking the US Navy, and Washington was telling him, engage the British here, and Hopkins was serving, he was loyal to his Rhode Island cronies. He was taking the ships and using them for the slave trade. He was running them down to Barbados to get cannons to defend Newport and other such things. So he really irked the Congress, not necessarily because of slavery, but because he wasn't listening to the Congress. He was still a Rhode Islander through and through. So he was disgraced and removed from office, but interestingly enough, he was never disgraced in Rhode Island. If you go to Rhode Island today, there are schools that bear his name, there are streets that bear his name. It's a story that really hasn't been told yet. So whistleblower protection with this Hopkins case, it starts as an American idea, and in the late 20th century, it became an Anglo-American concept. So it's first an American concept, it becomes an Anglo-American concept because Britain, the UK, passes some legislation in 1998. The continent looks at it and sees this is an Anglo-American thing. This is weird. But interestingly enough, I don't know if you followed it, but in April 2019 of this year, the European Union passed a landmark whistleblower protection directive designed to defend democratic values from corruption at odds with the public interest. It's a sweeping legislation. In other words, if the United States led on this, the EU surpassed them with this directive. It brings together anti-corruption measures in the corporate sector and in government in the same directive. So it's very interesting. What I think this tells us is that whistleblower protection is becoming an important yet underappreciated weapon for fighting populism and inequality in both the United States and in Europe. So that's the American origins. I told you this is a concept that resonates in different countries in different ways, so what about definitions? People use the term whistleblower in different ways, especially in different countries. So what am I talking about when I talk about a whistleblower? Well, you can see that when I'm talking about a whistleblower, I'm talking about something positive. That's because my definition originates in the United States, in an optimistic sort of environment. But whistleblowers aren't just leakers. That is to say, all whistleblowers are leakers, but not all leakers are whistleblowers. So I argue in my book that Julian Assange today is not a whistleblower, whereas Edmund Snowden today is. Leakers expose secrets, but secrets are not always a cover for misconduct. And we're seeing this in Britain today. Even if the revelations can embarrass individuals and destroy careers. So whistleblowers expose, as I'm defining them, they expose lies and wrongdoing, which their perpetrators would like to keep secret. It's intimately connected to the rule of law. Just as all leaking is not whistleblowing, all dissent is not whistleblowing. All whistleblowers are certainly dissenters in that they refuse to accept current circumstances, but all dissenters are not whistleblowers. Whistleblowers reveal truths that the powerful do not want to be made public, whereas dissenters simply disagree. Whistleblowing is a cousin of civil disobedience, but they are not one and the same. For Hannah Arendt, civil disobedience arises when a significant number of citizens have become convinced, quote, either that the normal channels of change no longer function, or that on the contrary, the government is about to change and has embarked upon and persists in modes of action whose legality and constitutionality are open to grave doubt. So civil disobedience break laws that they want to see changed. The classic example is civil rights actions in the American South. How do whistleblowers differ from that? Well, they differ from civil disobedience in that they appeal to the law or to the Constitution. That is to say, a rule of law tradition for justice. My definition is intimately connected to the rule of law, and whistleblowers protect the rule of law from people who are encroaching upon it. Whereas civil disobedience, what they do is they challenge directly the legitimacy of existing laws. Both variants of dissent require political judgment. Hannah Arendt saw civil disobedience as uniquely American, much like I see whistleblowing as an American concept in its origins. It was a manifestation for Arendt of what Tocqueville deemed America's greatest strength, the vitality of its associations, more commonly known as civil society. But while the ideas may find their origins in the New World, it is also of relevance to the Old. In a liberal democracy, a whistleblower is an insider who has evidence of illegal or improper conduct and exposes it, either to the authorities or to the press. Or put another way, whistleblowers draw attention to self-interested action at odds with the public interest. It's action that undermines public trust in democracy. Whistleblowers often reveal misconduct involving the use of private power for public power for private gain, which is the very definition of corruption, when people use a public office for private gain. Arendt is right, therefore, that both whistleblowing and civil disobedience are distinctly American in their origins, but they have become concepts, I will argue, to everyone who believes in the value of academic freedom and freedom of speech and expression. That the EU whistleblower directive passed at all is extraordinary. In 2013, Transparency International issued a report where they surveyed whistleblowing in Europe, and they looked at what the word for whistleblower was in all the European languages. And almost all of them are negative in EU member state languages. Whistleblowing had perhaps the worst connotations in post-communist Europe, especially for those of a certain age. For Germany, it conjured up images of Stasi and Nazi informers. For France, Vichy. I don't have to tell you what it probably conjures up in Hungary. That's why both Germany and France opposed the initiative in 2015. They were dead set against it. France had already gone through this huge effort to produce its own whistleblower law, which is sort of interesting. They're very, very proud of it. It's very good. And there have been calls on the part of Patrick Vey for France to give Snowden political asylum. And interestingly enough, Snowden in an interview yesterday said he would like political asylum in France. So that's something to watch in the time ahead. But the French didn't want this directive at first because they had their own law. The Germans just had immense problems with the very concept, especially in the lands of former East Germany. Whistleblowers sounded like informers. So they wanted nothing of it. But in just 4 years' time, they changed their mind. Why was that? I'm sure you can think of a number of things that happened in those 4-year time between 2015 and 2019 that might make a person committed to liberal democracy concerned about its future. But when you ask people about it, what you find out, I was just at the first meeting of the Whistleblowing International Network. I even have my little folder here, my swag from this conference in Glasgow. There were delegates from 38 countries around the world talking about increasing coordination between whistleblower civil society organizations in defense of values we hold dear. But when you talk to them, what you see is there's a great story to be told about people working together, about civil society organizations cooperating. There's some very skillful maneuvering and lobbying in Brussels. But two things that made a huge difference, if you followed it, were the death of investigative journalists in both Malta and Slovakia, who were exposing this corruption. They were involved in whistleblowing, and they were murdered. This is in relation to the Panama leaks, but also LuxLeaks happened in that period of time. If you followed any of those two scandals, we can talk about them if you like. And so this made France and Germany change their minds, so we now have the whistleblower directive. What the story of Europe's journey reveals is that whistleblowing, as I'm defining it, presupposes that the regime embodies ideals worth defending. When it does not, whistleblowing has negative connotations. You're an informer. You're betraying, your fellow countrymen for the sake of a corrupt regime. So it follows that whistleblowing, properly understood as I'm defining it, and I hope I've convinced you, is not a partisan issue, although populists always seek to spin it as such. Populist politicians in both Europe and the United States label genuine whistleblowers as traitors or a fifth column. Trump's attacks on the American intelligence community being the most prominent example. Whistleblowing, like civil disobedience, is an indirect call to renew the rule of law through new legislation defining corruption and the abuse of power. How does Donald Trump define whistleblowing? Well, he doesn't have much use for the fact-based world. Whistleblowing does. It wants to bring facts into the light. So for him, if you follow how he deals with it, whistleblowing is in the eye of the beholder. He gets to define what whistleblowing is. Because in the United States, interestingly enough, we all love whistleblowers. You say the word whistleblowers, you get both parties to cooperate, probably because of this history. But what happens in practice is something very, very different entirely, how whistleblowers are treated, and my book covers that at great length. But what Trump is doing is he wants to define it as what serves his interests, what denigrates others and elevates him. So Trump's definition renders whistleblowing a valuable partisan weapon or personal weapon for advancing his interests in a fake news world where truth and falsehood are whatever Trump decrees. So the American president wants us to believe that American law enforcement institutions and the people who lead them are corrupt partisans, even though these arguments often don't make any sense. They're serving one party one day, they're serving another party the other day. But this is intentional, because Trump intentionally sows confusion among the American electorate so that they, too, can confuse loyalty to Donald Trump with loyalty to their country. So let's talk about, this is the third part of my talk, Trump and the American intelligence community, because national security whistleblowing is the most difficult issue. Why? Well, national security officials have to protect classified information. So to blow the whistle, if you're in the national security sector, is by definition to break laws. So you really have to, it's something for extraordinary circumstances where you're going to have to break the law in order to defend the rule of law, which I argue is what Snowden did. By law in the United States, it's still officially a contradiction in terms. This is super interesting and confusing and almost Orwellian in some ways. I wouldn't use, that's a funny word to use to apply to the United States, but there are some conflicting interests here. And Congress wanted to get some kind of whistleblower protection. So protecting national security whistleblowers was always part of the discussion, and then it wound up being sacrificed as part of a compromise to just get the protection legislation. So by law today, national security whistleblowing is a contradiction in terms. If you are a member of the national security community, national security employee, the Whistleblower Protection Enhancement Act of 1989 and 2012 doesn't protect you. So why are there inspector generals at the NSA? Why are people saying go to the NSA? Well, these institutions exist, but they're hampered by not having statutory protection. And indeed, if Snowden would have gone to George Allard, the head of the NSA's Inspector General, we would not know about what he had to reveal, because this man was forced to resign from his job for retaliating against a whistleblower. The person in the accountability office retaliated against someone who was attempting to blow the whistle. Obama tried to do some workarounds with executive orders, making it more confusing, but essentially you're not protected by law in the national security realm. So this is why Snowden did what he did. And we can talk about his case in the Q&A if you're interested. Happy to entertain any questions on Assange or Snowden. I've studied this forever. And I'm midway through the memoir. What I want to focus on today is the extraordinary, unprecedented leaking from the American intelligence community since Trump's election. Exhibit A is former FBI Director James Comey. In his memoir, A Higher Loyalty, James Comey repeatedly compares Trump to a mafia boss. That's because Donald Trump's idea of governance mirrors the way in which a criminal corruption network advances its interests. So why does Comey say this? The simple answer is that for Donald Trump, there's practically no norm associated with the intelligence community that Trump has not ignored. It is truly extraordinary. I've been studying national security for most of my adult life. I teach American foreign policy. I've thought about these things for a long time. And it's just like turning everything on its head. Up is down, down is up. Everything is going out the window. And you're seeing the intelligence community respond to that by leaking, which is something they never want to do. Comey is part of this. But he felt he had to do it. Why? Well, let's just take a close look at Comey. The FBI director is not supposed to be a partisan position. Justice is supposed to be impartial. They're supposed to serve 10-year terms. But for Trump, it was otherwise. So Barack Obama meets with James Comey twice, only twice. He meets with him once, one-on-one without anybody there, to say, I'm considering you for the position of FBI director. He meets with him a second time when he's decided he's going to choose him, nominate him, and says, I'm nominating you. And then he never has a one-on-one conversation with him. In contrast, in just 4 short months, and I can chronicle all this for you. I won't belabor each incident. Each one is extraordinary in its own right. In just 4 short months after his inauguration, Trump met with Comey one-on-one without anyone present, no less than 4 times. And he also, he is the standing FBI director, and he also spoke with him by phone one-on-one 4 times. Comey wrote memos on all this. Those personal memos chronicling it, he was so alarmed by the behavior, are what he eventually turned over to the New York Times. And there's some argument about whether what he did is legal or illegal. It definitely breaks norms, no question about it. But he did it because he was concerned that Trump was trying to secure his loyalty. And his loyalty was the truth or to the Constitution. And there are other leaks. I just want to go through a few of them, documenting the same behavior that can be explained and understood in the same fashion. The leaking in February 2017 of some contents of Michael Flynn's December 2016 conversations with the Russian ambassador Kislyak, which were picked up by U.S. intelligence, exposed potentially treasonous, which is another word for disloyalty to the Constitution of the United States, behavior on the part of Trump advisor and former national security advisor Michael Flynn. Remember, Flynn had denied discussing the possible removal of Russian sanctions imposed by President Obama, and the leak revealed that he'd lied, which led to his resignation. The contents of some of Trump advisor and former U.S. Attorney General Jeff Sessions' conversations with the same ambassador, Kislyak, during the 2016 campaign were leaked for similar reasons. Trump welcomed the Russian ambassador and Russian foreign minister to the Oval Office the day after Comey's dismissal. He was fired. He didn't resign. The Russians were in the Oval Office, and he barred the American press corps from covering the meeting. So in this weird twist, Very surreal. Americans learned from Russian news sources that our president had disclosed classified information from a U.S. ally about an ISIS terrorist threat. Same thing pertains to the leaking of Trump's March 20th, 2018 call with Vladimir Putin. I don't know if you remember this. It was another extraordinary story. NSC officials, National Security Council officials, they realized that they can't get Trump to read the briefing books. So Putin is reelected. His officials put a big note card that says just this: do not congratulate. Trump congratulates Putin on his reelection warmly anyway. This leaks out to the media, and 2 days after the leak, a furious Trump fired his national security advisor, H.R. McMaster. And there are all sorts of former officials, intelligence officials, in the media decrying this behavior. Michael Hayden, who's the former chief of the NSA and CIA, wrote for the New York Times, "We in the intelligence world have dealt with obstinate and argumentative presidents through the years, but we have never served a president for whom ground truth really doesn't matter." For intelligent people, that matters. This may sound familiar to some of you. So to be sure, there are some IC leaks. I won't belabor them if you want to know them, that fall into this kind of gray area where they shouldn't be leaking those. It's an overstretch. Those fall into the realm of policy decisions. You know, it's not a betrayal of democracy for the president to be stupid. You know, we would like the president to be smart, but that probably isn't grounds for revealing information about the stupidity. So there are some gray areas. But this leak about the note card with "do not congratulate" revealed more than strategic ineptitude. It pointed to Trump's loyalty to his relationship with Putin rather than to his own White House staff. And all of this is unprecedented. So what are the implications of this for the United States and Europe? And I'll conclude with this because I'm quite interested in knowing what Michael thinks about this. I'm sure he has a lot to say. And what all of you think about this. We can talk about the things that interest you. But what are the implications of what I've just sketched for you? I think it is not partisan or treasonous to conclude that intelligence community whistleblowers have it right, and Trump is a threat to both freedom and liberal democracy. So a leaking intelligence community in normal times does not bolster the security of the free world. In abnormal times, it does. Trump insists that the intelligence community is behaving in partisan fashion and attacking him. I think there's zero evidence for this claim. And I can rehearse the reasons for you if that's of interest to you, but I'll just cite one example here that I think speaks volumes. More than 800 Department of Justice employees have signed an open letter. They're former Department of Justice employees. You can't do this when you're actually in government. Although it may come to that, who knows? They signed an open letter calling on Congress to, quote, "swiftly and forcefully respond to protect the founding principles of our republic and the rule of law if Trump were to fire Special Counsel Robert S. Mueller III or other senior Justice Department officials." So 800 sign on to that publicly. Why do we not find a rival petition from former Department of Justice personnel standing up for Trump principles? If this were a partisan issue, you'd have a petition from other ones saying the same thing. There is not one. So in short, there's indeed a political judgment involved in arguing that extraordinary times demand extraordinary actions. And I would argue to you that we are in extraordinary times where democracy is threatened, under challenge. But today's intelligence community whistleblowing to defend the republic is nonpartisan. It only looks partisan from the vantage point of presumed normalcy. In his book, Just and Unjust Wars, Michael Walzer cites the British dishonoring of Arthur Harris under Prime Minister Winston Churchill as an example of leadership that fully acknowledged the supreme danger in using immoral means, taking symbolic steps to put the community back on track after the war was won and the threat to democracy had receded. Harris was the leader of Britain's Bomber Command and an advocate administrator of terror bombing of Dresden and other sites. Harris, in its aftermath, did not win a peerage. And if you go to Westminster Abbey, what you'll see is that the names of the fallen members of his bomber squadron do not appear on the plaque honoring the fallen. You'll find the fighter pilots are there, but not the bomber pilots. And that's because, as Walser points out, Churchill wanted to dissociate from Harris after the war had been won, as part of a national dissociation designed to restore the moral universe that Harris had been ordered to violate to defend freedom and democracy. I would argue that the intelligence community's unprecedented behavior is indeed a disruption of the moral universe that will quickly need to be restored to normalcy after Trump's presidency if the rule of law is to be sustained and fortified in the United States. Once President Trump has been dishonored by being forced out of office, either through impeachment, resignation, or free and fair elections, both his trespasses and the unusual behavior of the intelligence community of late must be condemned to reaffirm those values that Trump sought to overthrow. Put another way, when the democratic system itself is potentially at stake, a whistleblowing intelligence community is a necessary evil, but it is not one Americans would be wise to tolerate for any length of time. All of this is depressing to recount. It's my country. I don't like to come to Europe and have to tell you this. But it helps to keep the big picture in mind. American democracy has been around a long time. British democracy and the supremacy of Parliament have been around even longer. Defending freedom and individual rights against their enemies is a long war that requires vigilance and tenacity. But the right to seek truth and knowledge, which this university, under Michael Ignatieff's leadership, embodies, is worth fighting for. We're in Budapest. We're in beautiful Central Europe. I think I'm staying in a hotel. I can't read Hungarian, so someone's going to have to translate it for me, that Franz Liszt once lived in. Host. What does that mean? Live? H-O-Z-T? I might have been remembering the Hungarian wrong, but I'll check it with someone later. It's the 30th anniversary of the escape from communist dictatorship this fall. I think it's valuable to remember that moment, which Václav Havel captured so well in his first New Year's speech as president of Czechoslovakia. I went back and reread this morning, so I wanted to read you a portion of it. He began, "My dear fellow citizens, for 40 years you heard from my predecessors on this day different variations on the same theme, how our country was flourishing, how many million tons of steel we produced, how happy we all were, how we trusted our government, and what bright perspectives were unfolding in front of us. I assume you did not propose me for this office so that I, too, would lie to you. Our country is not flourishing." And Havel went on to describe the republic he envisioned, the ideal that would animate his future actions. He said, quote, "I dream of a republic independent, free, and democratic, of a republic economically prosperous and yet socially just. In short, of a humane republic that serves the individual and that therefore holds the hope that the individual will serve it in turn." And Havel concluded with a paraphrase of the Czech educator Komensky in saying, "People, your government has been returned to you." In a democracy, even one forced to brave a formidable stress test, you don't need a revolution for your government to be returned to you. Citizens simply have to demand it. Whistleblowers and citizen resistance are the key to getting liberal democracy back on the rails and keeping our elites honest, both in Washington and in Europe. Thank you for your attention. I'd welcome your questions.